I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare Anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode.
Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How about you?
I'm also doing pretty well. I am always shocked when we get to this episode.
Yeah.
Because it's just a testament that time is flying.
It's really hard to believe that we've been at this for 4 years.
Yeah.
4 full years of Shakespeare Anyone and 8 plays. And we reached, I don't know exactly which episode it was, but this year we surpassed 100 episodes of Shakespeare Anyone, which feels like a really huge accomplishment.
It does, especially because we started this podcast during the pandemic isolation period when we were not able to perform or do anything theater practitioner related unless it was on Zoom. And I believe, unless someone has redone the math, I believe the average episode for a podcast is 7 episodes.
Wow.
There are so many podcasts out there, and
that's
many
true.
of them, everyone has a podcast, and everyone made a podcast during 2020, 2021, including us. And the average for like all of the podcasts is like 7 episodes. So we have certainly surpassed that milestone as podcasters, like within the podcast world. And then personally, like over 100 is bananas.
Yes. Bananas is such a good way to put it. I was actually talking to somebody last night about the podcast, and somebody that I work with in theater, and they asked me like, oh, like, how many episodes you got? And I was like, over 100. And they're like, oh, I know we're at that point where when I talk to people about the podcast in my life, I'm like, oh yeah, we have episodes. We have an incredible community of listeners that includes, professors who tell us that they are sharing this podcast with their students, and how rewarding that is, or people who reach out to us and say that they are re-engaging with Shakespeare after not really enjoying it in high school, and our podcast is helping them, and how cool that's been to be part of that journey for 4 years.
Yeah.
This year we took some big leaps as a podcast. We became an LLC. Some behind the scenes fun facts for people. We launched merch on our Patreon, and we've got some big plans for 2025. I also talked to somebody recently about the podcast. They asked me, what's the biggest difference between starting this in 2020 and launching in 2021 and now? And I said, some things have gotten easier and some things have gotten harder.
Amen. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You mentioned when we started, we were doing things in isolation. This was our outlet for needing theater, you and I.
Mm-hmm.
And, I spent probably 9-10 months out of this year working on shows. You've been in 2 master's programs. So our lives have also exploded. So I said, time has gotten harder, but also we've grown so much as podcasters and as scholars. And I think that's, really reflected in our decision to go back and revise our intro series this year and make a better version now that we are 4 years older, 4 years wiser.
Yes. Yeah, we've grown as podcasters, as scholars, as writers, as people who use Shakespeare outside of this podcast world. So it is a feat. And I think that we should be proud of ourselves. And I want to thank all of you listeners for supporting us through listening, through following us on social media, telling friends about us. If you are Patreon patrons, thank you for contributing monetarily as well as engaging in that lively community we have on Patreon. So thank you, everyone. I think that's a very important thing to tell everyone as we conclude 2024 with our revisiting Romeo and Juliet and Much Ado episode.
Yes, I agree. Now let's get into this revisiting. As we do every year, we reread the plays that we read this year to sort of wrap up our year and look back at them with the knowledge that we've gained through our research for the podcast. So starting off with how we started our year, Romeo and Juliet. What were some things that popped out at you this time when you revisited it?
There were a lot of things. Dueling and the very clear roles of like this vendetta, the duels, the two households was a lot clearer to me in this read because of the work we did with vendettas and duels. Like in 1-1 with Gregory and Samson, Gregory says, the quarrel is between our masters and us, their men. Samson says, 'tis all one. And in that same scene, there's these citizens who I think might get cut from shows oftentimes, but they say clubs, bills, partisans, strike, beat them down with the Capulets, down with the Montagues. And so it is very clear that this ancient grudge that is being rekindled is a nuisance to everyone. And I have lost that in some of my readings and like viewings of Romeo and Juliet. But it's really fun to know that vendettas, well, the play doesn't really use the like Italian vendettas as much as they use the early modern dueling in the language and in the characters. Having that historical background about duels made this tension really, really strong and sharp. And Tybalt is often seen as being very feisty and fiery. He is called fiery, but in a lot of ways, I think that he is the much more controlled duelist compared to Mercutio, who is totally prodding and totally instigating. Yeah. So Tybalt gets this bad rep for being fiery and, you know, wanting to just fight all the time. And I think he does want to fight all the time.
Yeah.
But it's very different from, I think, the like preconceived notion of Tybalt.
Yes, I would agree with all of that. For me, what also popped out was time and the urgency that all of the younger characters have. Romeo, Juliet specifically. And I think, you know, we see it in Tybalt and Mercutio as well. It's like things have to happen now. And the difference between the older generation and how slowly the older generation takes things. I've seen a few people more recently talk about this. Like, time is a huge factor. And it's not something that I think is always part of productions that I've seen. And I think that this time it just was really, really clear to me that like the pace of the young people versus the pace of the older generation is a major theme and conflict and causes some of the conflict in this play.
Yeah, I see that as well. And there's language about that where like first Capulet is like, oh, Juliet is not yet 13, you know, give her 2 more summers. And then there's also dialogue between Friar Lawrence and Romeo about time.
Yeah,
and
they stumble that run
things
fast.
Slowly. And same with the nurse and Juliet when the nurse comes back from delivering the message to Romeo and Juliet's like, tell me, what did he say? And then the nurse is like, oh, I'm so tired. Let me just rest. Let me, you know, take it, you know, I'm out of breath. And so I think that you're right.
And I think there are a few times where the older generation might pick up speed. You know, when does that accelerate the action of the play? You know, for example, in 1-1, when both of the old Capulet and old Montague come in ready to fight and their wives are holding them back, that accelerates the duel in that, you know, it reaches a point where the prince comes out and tells everybody that they're going to be punished severely if they fight again. And then things kind of slow down. And then after Tybalt's death, the older generation starts picking up speed again.
Yeah.
Okay, no, now we're going to just marry Paris and Juliet. It would be very interesting for a production to find a way to track that, at least for the actors.
Yeah. And sticking with Capulet, my rereading made me really think about how Capulet needs to be done with care. There should be more Capulets that are like the public theater's Leonardo.
I also said more Capulets like Tamsin Griggs.
Yes. It's all subjective, but I think that there's stronger choices, especially when we want to still like mourn with the parents when Juliet and Romeo have died.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if the fast pace for Capulet marrying off, and we might have talked about this and I just forgot about it, but maybe the fast pace for having Juliet marry Paris is an inheritance based thing where it's like, okay, Tybalt is gone. She's my only daughter. It is time to marry her off right now in case something bad happens. Where does my estate go?
Right.
Where does my money, my land go? So that's from the Much Ado stuff, but I read it and I was like, oh, I wonder if like this is the justification for this choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that's like not clearly stated in the text, but could definitely be motivation for an actor to play. Speaking about Much Ado, what did you notice about Much Ado?
I noticed a lot more of the Book of the Courtier, the potential commentary.
Yeah, same. The thing that I kept reflecting on was the just like codified behavior that is laid into Much Ado that doesn't always. And I understand that in production this could be very difficult, but I think there's ways to do it. I think that there are time periods you can set this in that can lend to there being a need for codified behavior. And also for me, it was like I wrote down the boys, Don Pedro and Benedict and Claudio. I want to see more productions engage with more readings of this play where they are not well behaved at the beginning and they are rowdy. I actually said I want them to behave a little bit more like Romeo and Friends. Romeo and Friends are often rowdy.
Right.
I think there's more of that in Much Ado, and we so often that element is lost.
And just because Don Pedro is the prince, that does not mean he has authority like Prince Aeschylus.
Yes, I think that looking at those dynamics and changing them up is what really stood out to me of like, this is in there and this could be more present and it might help solve some issues that exist in a play. Yeah.
It seems like more thought goes into Beatrice and Hero and how the two women characters are going to behave and their role with everyone else compared to the men characters. I don't know.
Yeah.
That might not be true, but it seems like there's a lot of discussion about Beatrice and Hero in scholarship and perhaps less about the boys.
And they could be more of a crew of bachelors.
Totally.
Okay, so we both picked up on something else though.
Yes.
Which is how many parallels these plays have, how many things they have in common, which is very fascinating to realize in retrospect because we picked both of these plays based on vibes.
Yes.
No forethought.
There was no discussion of like intertextual interplay themes, motifs, topics.
Yeah.
It was just, what do you feel like?
What do you want to do?
Right now, it feels like it's time for Romeo and Juliet. That's just
like where I want to go next. We said like Romeo and Juliet in unison when we picked it. And then, when it came time to pick the next one, we were like, we kind of want to do a comedy. Like, what's out there? We're seeing a lot of productions of Much Ado being announced for this summer. Seems like a good summer to do Much Ado.
And
then so much intertextual play. Wow. What did you notice?
So I noticed that there were daughters who were only children. So Juliet and Hero are both only children, only daughters. And this is a point of deep mourning for both Capulet and Leonardo when both Juliet and Hero have betrayed their family and their parents through both like saying, no, I'm not going to marry Paris, as well as the accusation that Hero is unfaithful to Claudio. And both fathers say something like, oh, I only have one child and she's this. So I thought that was really interesting. So that was one that I found.
I will go kind of off of that.
Okay.
What I wrote was Much Ado feels like many of the same character archetypes and perhaps like same actors that he's writing for in my like romantic imagination, but just older.
Yeah.
So like both Claudio and Romeo are led to believe that Juliet Hero is dead when she isn't.
And they're both the lovers. Yeah.
They're both the lovers, but they're like older. They're not like teenagers.
Yes.
There's Mercutio, who's the Joker, which would be Benedict. And then there's Benvolio and Don Pedro, who are like, they are kind, is kind of their big
thing
character trait that people often play of like, they're a good guy.
Very benevolent.
Very benevolent. There are some characters that don't exactly line up, but
Mm-hmm.
it does feel in the same way that I sometimes think that Coriolanus and Macbeth are related in some way because of the character archetypes we see repeated there. This one feels like we've got something similar going on of like one of them feels, and I looked up like original production dates. Romeo and Juliet came first and was written probably in 1591 through 1595.
Mm-hmm.
And Much Ado was written 1598 through 1599.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yeah, it does feel like 4 years have passed, at least.
Yeah.
And here are some of these same themes again. What about you? What's another thing that you noticed?
Yes. So yes to all of that. I also noticed, and this wouldn't go with like casting, but like there are two princes, Prince Aeschylus and Prince Dom Pedro. And their authority is, I think, in opposition, like whether they actually are able to. And of course, Prince Aeschylus is teetering between like there is peace and now there is, family war. And then Dom Pedro is a bachelor who probably isn't living up to the princely duties and the expectations. But there are two princes. Also, both have masks.
Yes, very early, early in the action.
These, like, yeah, early in the action. And that was another thing I saw that was similar. Also, window/balcony scenes.
Yes, especially because Romeo and Juliet, it's not written to be a balcony scene because balconies in England did not exist during Shakespeare's time. So it would have been speaking, the way that it is written is speaking at the window. We put it in a balcony because that's just a common thing that productions have done for hundreds of years at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also picked up, I was like, oh, these are two speaking out the window scenes.
Mm-hmm. And they're two speaking out the window scenes with different conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So Shakespeare is not necessarily using all of these characters, these archetypes, these positions, these plot points.
Tropes
for the same end, but he's still
exploring a lot of the same. Yeah.
Exactly.
We've also got, you mentioned this earlier, but we've got disappointed/mad dads in Capulet and Leonato after their daughters are disappointing them. And both of them, like, as we've said, we want to see choices that are being made out there, and we just want to see it more common of like not violence against women.
Juliet and Hero, yeah.
Yeah.
Both have themes of age, like the older members of the family in both the Capulets and Montagues, as well as in Messina, and the younger ones. There's dueling in both.
The deception around Hero's death versus the deception around Juliet's.
Friars in both.
Fake death. Friars in both.
Friars. Yeah.
Friars making fake deaths happen in both.
Yes.
Again, to very different ends. One is a comedy and one is a tragedy.
And musicians in both. The musicians that have those scenes with Peter, which often gets cut in production. And then there's Balthazar and all the music from him or other musicians.
Yeah.
Anything else substantial?
So both have, I would say, gendered expectations of their characters, which is, that's, people might hear that and be like, well, it was the early modern era, Elyse.
Of the time.
That's just the time period. But I think these are like specific in a way that like parallels each other and examines the roles of the gender binary in early modern England in similar ways, like what the expectations were for these young people who are of noble status. Yeah,
a shocking amount of these parallels.
I think that's one reason why Much Ado, is a great alternative to teach in a educational environment if students have not been engaging well with Romeo and Juliet. Much Ado covers a lot of the same themes in different ways that might engage them differently than Romeo and Juliet. When I've talked to young people about Romeo and Juliet, it's really hard to actually engage and understand that these teenagers are written well when you are a teenager yourself, because you're like, I wouldn't act like that. This is ridiculous. Even, a few years out of high school, you're like, oh yeah, it is kind of ridiculous. Things do move fast. People do have very serious relationships for a month. And it is the most important thing. But when you're in it, you don't quite see it that way. And Much Ado has, I think, more in it that if you're trying to be #relatable, there's more in it that is actually relatable. Things like gossip, things like reputation, Romeo and Juliet can feel a little bit like, how do you do, fellow kids? Trying to relate because these characters are your age.
My theory is that Romeo and Juliet was written for the adults, not for the teenagers. So it could land on deaf ears for a 14 through 18-year-old.
I was taking a drink of water and I was like, oh, I would like, if we were in person, I would like clap or snap to that point. But I was like, that will sound horrible in audio.
Thank you. But I have one last conclusion.
Great.
I do want to do a shout out to some of the topics and characters that if we were to redo Romeo and Juliet and Much Ado, I would like for us to dive deeper into. When we come back to this play, for whatever reason, I would love to look more at masks and court balls. I also would like to dive deeper into friars and nurses, and also waiting women.
I think those sound like great minis for for more than just these plays, much like how we finally got around to Bastards with this play. I feel like we're going to run into friars and waiting women and nurses again, potentially. But with that wraps up our 2024 Romeo and Juliet and Much Ado About Nothing. 2 plays we picked purely based on vibes and ended up being a really great pairing for this year. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, and ever thanks to our Patreon patrons, Sue and Fairy Kim.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From Richard II, Act 5, Scene 4, said by Exton. "Have I no friend," quoth he. "He spake it twice, and urged it twice together, did he not?"